Hello everybody, welcome to our first video lesson on the Concerto Through Time. I'm going to get straight into things. There will be a supporting resource for this video, so please make sure that you've got that. So it will be worksheet number 1. And the purpose of this video is I am going to give you some information basically from me just talking at you, and the resource, the worksheet, will have some questions for you to fill in. Some I want everybody to fill in, and that's sort of the basic level of understanding I want you to have, and then there will also be some sort of extra challenge questions for you to go and do some further research for if you have time and if you wish, if you want to push yourself. So at the very least I want you to fill in the main questions, and the purpose of today's session is to give you the background information basically, and to give you the context. What are we talking about when we say a concerto? What do we mean the concerto through time? What time period are we dealing with here? What's the overall sort of genre that we're looking at? And don't worry if this is all very unfamiliar to you. Some of you do not play orchestral instruments, which means that you will very unlikely have performed a concerto in that setting at all. You might not have ever heard one before, and that's completely fine. I am going to give you sort of required compulsory listening to do, as well as extended extra optional listening to do. So depending on how confident you feel about this, there will be varying amounts that you can get involved with and dip in and dip out to sort of secure your understanding. But yeah, there's lots of new things to cover. This topic, out of all of the listening topics, I feel is very knowledge dense. Obviously in the listening exam, it's a listening exam, it's about appraisal, so you are listening to extracts and you are commenting on what you hear. However, those comments often have to be backed up by contextual understanding and prior knowledge. So it's not enough to be like, oh, well, that's a flute. You have to be able to say, for example, suggest a composer who might have composed this. What particular style is this? What musical devices that are typical of this style have you just heard? You have to be able to name specific devices, name specific instruments. I mean, you will know that from Rhythms of the World, where there was obviously a lot of terminology. With the Concerto Through Time, I think the main bulk of it is knowing kind of specific terms for musical features, so types of texture, types of melody, ways that melodies were developed. You also do need to know dates and composers, and you need to know a little bit about the venues that this type of music was performed in. So there is quite a lot of sort of historical understanding that will need to support your answers on the listening paper. So it's quite a good one in a way to do remotely, because I can just witter away at you with lots and lots of facts. Your worksheets will help you sort of condense those facts and pull out the most pertinent learning points. And then when we come back to revising this topic, we'll be doing a lot more listening and practicing and sort of regurgitating that knowledge, but within the listening context. However, I am going to set you listening questions as well as we go along, so I can check your understanding. So I think it's going to work okay, and hopefully this is working for you. So make sure that you've got the worksheet with you. If you want, you can look at the questions now and pause me. That might help if you feel that you are likely to get distracted and daydream and not focus. So if you've read the questions, you know what information you're looking for. And you can really zone in on it when I talk about it. Another way of doing it, which might be better sort of cognitively to see how much you're picking up, is for you to just watch this video and try and absorb as much as you can, then go and try and answer the questions on the sheet, see what you've remembered, see what you've retained, and then go back and watch the video again and find any information that you weren't able to fill in the first time. But I'm going to leave it up to you. That's the beauty of this, that you can kind of adapt it and do it as you want. Don't have to do it all in one go either, because you can pause it and come back to it. So yeah, whatever works for you. So what I'm going to do now is just talk you through a kind of overview, and there are three three main learning points for today, session 1 on the Concerto Through Time. Learning point number 1 is, what do we mean by classical music as opposed to popular music? Learning point number 2 is, what is a concerto? And learning point number 3 is, what do we mean by the concerto through time? What time periods are we looking at? And you might know this already if you've looked at your CGP book, but there are actually 3 specific named periods that we have to look at. And today I want you to come away with an understanding of what those 3 are, what the dates are, and kind of why they fit, how it all works. So going back to number 1, classical music versus popular music. Okay, I want you to just have a think for a moment about how you would describe classical music as opposed to pop music or popular music. So if we were in a lesson, this is the point at which I would ask you to have a conversation on your table and talk about it, but we can't do that, so you can pause and have a think, or you can just keep listening. I think a key way of identifying classical music is the fact that it is considered a high art form. So it's an art form alongside art as a medium in itself, alongside architecture, alongside literature. When we refer to classical music generally in this country, what we're talking about is Western art music. And when I say Western, I mean European. The countries that have really mainly generated classical music in the last few centuries are France, Germany, Austria, Italy, and England. But we also do have influences from Russia, so further east. We do have American influences, so further west, but those didn't really come to the fore until a bit later. So going back to sort of the beginning of music, and this is a bit of a history lesson here, we're talking sort of 15th century, 14th century, music was obviously incredibly different to what it is now. And you had really 2 kind of streams of where music was coming from. That was secular and sacred. So secular means non-sacred, non-religious. And sacred music would be heard in churches, and it would be vocal music sung by monks. So you might have heard of plain song before. You had monks creating music in their church services. And then in addition, you would have secular music. Now, this could be, for example, old ancient trumpets, and you're having a trumpeter outside your castle, and when the king returns, you have a trumpet playing a fanfare. You might have that. You also might have sort of your wandering minstrel playing on a kind of violin-y type thing, probably a lute or an early version of a lute, and kind of creating some music to sort of symbolise something or accompany maybe some kind of festival or social event or occasion. But it was very much a concept in its infancy. The idea of groups of musicians performing together to entertain an audience just didn't exist until the end of the Renaissance, which was in the 16th century. And during the Renaissance, which is maybe a term that you've heard of, there was a huge development across Europe in terms of the arts. And art itself, art that you look at, sculpture included in that, architecture, literature, was all rapidly developing, and really sort of people's ideas of culture and sort of sophisticated art forms was really taking shape. And it was only at that stage that music started to be recognised as an art form in itself. composers started composing more elaboratively, and sort of principles of style and structure developed. Instruments started being made that were crafted more efficiently, and we also developed notation. So staff notation was developed. There were sort of links to notation from earlier. So when the monks were chanting their plain song, some monks would note down the plain song, but it was a very sort of early version of what we now know as staff notation, with our treble clefs and our bass clefs. And so all of these different things sort of happening at the same time basically emerged in music being considered a cultural high art form that was enjoyable to listen to. And that was the start of what we know as classical music. It's quite elitist in a way, because certainly at that stage, it was only music that was accessible to wealthy people. So kings and queens and the sort of aristocracy in these countries, they were able to command musicians to compose pieces of instrumental music for their own entertainment. I won't go into detail now about how composers were commissioned to write works, but basically the performance of this music was very much just for the wealthy. It would be in palaces and castles and the king's court and wealthy people's homes. It wasn't widely available. You didn't have concert halls, you didn't have public arenas where music could be performed yet. And it was really in the 17th century, so between 1600 and 1650, let's say, that there really started to emerge a style in the West, these European countries, a style of composition that was considered elegant and sophisticated and cultural and was considered art that wealthy people listened to. And simultaneously, it also started to be notated. So composers would be producing pieces of music that were written down and notated for highly skilled musicians to learn and perform. And, you know, it became something to really strive for, to be able to be good enough to perform at a high level, to be a professional musician. It became thought of as a real skill and a real talent. And music developed, and it was very stylized. So people were composing in very similar ways. Obviously, no two pieces of music are the same, but there was very much a sort of general defining style in the 17th century that developed. We were obviously going to go into much more detail about what that style entailed at a later date. And that was the beginning of how classical music really truly formed. Okay, so now to consider the difference between that and popular music. So popular music, by definition, is music that is available to the masses and that is accessible to everybody and anyone. It also, and I'm worried about saying this because I think some of you are going to be offended, it also, technically speaking, popular music is music that you do not have to be as highly skilled to play it. You don't have to be educated in how to perform on your instrument to such a level. Now, I would personally argue against that now. I think pop music has developed. If you think about like some of the guitar solos that people play in certain types of rock music or metal music, that is equally challenging, if not far more so, than really complex writing for string instruments, you know, for violins, that's in the classical idiom. But technically speaking, just as a blanket definition, popular music is less skilled. It is less of a high art form. It is a lower art form. It is more widely available, more widely accessible. People are more easily able to perform it and access it. And when we talk about pop music, popular music, now there are obviously loads and loads of different styles of popular music, you know, all the different subcategories and genres. And for your conventions of pop, we've focused in on 4 of those genres, obviously. So 1950s rock and roll, pop ballads, rock anthems, and 20th century solo artists. So those are the specifics, but they all fall under this umbrella term of popular music. So that's the contrast between popular and classical. So in the 17th century, when classical music was really coming together as an art form, you still did have folk music and folk musicians, which would technically kind of qualify as the popular music of the time. The next thing I'm going to talk about, the next sort of main learning point, is what is a concerto? And as I said before, don't worry, if you've never heard of a concerto before, I'm not expecting you to have. In classical music, as I've been saying, it's considered this high art form, this sort of sophisticated idiom of artistic performance. You have specific types of composition. You have specific groupings of ensemble and specific types of composition or specific types of work. So work is another noun you can use rather than composition. I hope that you have heard of an orchestra before. So classical music used the orchestra, developed again in this period, in the start of the 17th century, the idea of an orchestra and that sort of collection of musicians playing all together, and composers started writing different specific types of work. One of them was a symphony, so hopefully you have heard of the word symphony, and a symphony is a piece of music written for an orchestra. So everybody in the orchestra is involved and kind of on an equal footing. It is a big ensemble piece. You might have heard of smaller ensembles like a string quartet. You've got trios, quintets, quartets, sextets, different groupings of instruments, but they are still orchestral instruments, but they're just in smaller groups, and they can play a range of different things. And then you've got the term concerto. So a concerto is different to a symphony because a concerto has a soloist at the front, or sometimes a group of soloists. There are lots of other similarities in terms of the structure of how a symphony is sort of put together to how a concerto is. But for the purposes of this exam, we are only going to be looking at concertos. So these are pieces of music where you had one soloist being the kind of main, most important person that everybody was wanting to come and see, and the rest of the orchestra were kind of behind them, not on the podium, in an accompanying role. And that came about because, as I said, music was becoming more sophisticated. Rich people wanted to see musicians playing. They wanted to have music at their elaborate parties. And the concept of having a really skilled musician who was absolutely phenomenal at their instrument was something that was quite new. So you wanted to show them off, and composers wanted to be able to write pieces of music that were for an ensemble, but that their sort of star violin player or their star oboe player could be at the front and could have a leading role. So that's really how the concerto came about. So it's a soloist or 2, 3, 4 soloists, the best musicians at the front, and the role, the music that's been written for them makes them stand out the most, and the rest of the orchestra, the rest of the ensemble is sort of behind them and in an accompanying role. Okay, so the final thing to talk about are the sort of subsections of, we say, the concerto through time. So what time periods are we actually talking about? How do we define this? So as I've been going on about, the 17th century, so the end of the Renaissance, after that, we have our first period where classical music was becoming a thing. And that period of musical history is called the Baroque period. You might have heard the term Baroque. We can refer to Baroque art, Baroque literature, Baroque architecture. So the Baroque period of music is music that was composed between 1600, so the start of the 17th century. Remember, you have to go up when you're talking about the century. Start of the 17th century to halfway through the 18th century. So 1600 to 1750. Some people think that the first 50 years of the 17th century, so 1600 to 1650, shouldn't really be called the Baroque yet because the style hadn't really materialised. It wasn't a really cohesive style that everyone was following. However, OCR think that from 1600 is fine. I think that from 1600 is fine, and that's the date I want you to remember. So the Baroque period was a period of time that is defined by common stylistic similarities across Europe, across these Western countries, of the type of music and the type of style that composers were composing in. In the same way that nowadays, in this century, we can talk about rock and roll in the 50s and 60s being a particular style with particular musical features, or we can talk about a ballad being a particular type of pop song, a particular type of composition. Back then, obviously, we're dealing with a much longer period, but the Baroque period was a stylistic period. It's a genre of music in itself that spanned 150 years, and Baroque music falls into that category of classical music. But Baroque is the specific name. So we are going to be learning about the features of the Baroque. We are going to be learning about the instruments that were available to composers, to musicians, and specific composers. I'll just throw one out there for you. Bach, or you're meant to say Bach and do like a sort of phlegmy thing with your throat, but you can just say Bach. So B-A-C-H. You might have heard of him. You might have heard of Vivaldi. They are very famous, well-known Baroque composers. So this is hundreds of years ago, and all composers were obviously composing music that was their own. They weren't copying others, they had their individual styles, but there was a very generalized style that they were all feeding into of what was considered sophisticated, what was considered this high art form that rich people wanted to have played in their houses. After the Baroque period, we have what we now call the classical period. And that's where everybody gets confused because it's the word classical. And we've just been talking about classical music. So classical music is the whole umbrella term for this high art form music that's written down. The classical period, with capital letters, the classical period was a specific period of time in history where music had a distinctive style. Classical music had a distinctive style, and it was called the classical period. So this middle period that we are going to look at and we're going to study was from 1750, so the end of the Baroque. It started in 1750, the classical period, and lasted for about 70 years, so up to about 1820. Now, obviously, it wasn't like overnight. On January the 1st, 1750 or 1751, somebody said, right, we're going to compose differently, we're going to do things differently now. There was a sort of gradual shift, but that is the time that historians, musicologists, so people that study music, that's the point at which they sort of say, no, okay, we really were moving into quite a different style of music. And that was influenced by all sorts of things. It was influenced by the fact that concert halls were being built. They started being built, and that took off as a trend very, very quickly across Europe. So music was available to the masses. The reasons why music was being created changed. Instruments had been developing, so composers had different instruments at their disposal. And just what was stylish and what was fashionable changed in the same way that, we listen to music from the 80s now and we're like, yeah, that's not fashionable anymore. It just changed. And that new style was called the classical period. Now, the fact that it says classical is actually a link to ancient Greece and classics, but we'll go into that when we do that in more detail. So that's our kind of middle period. We had the Baroque, then we have the classical period, and then the final period of musical history takes over from the end of the classical period around 1820, and that last period is called the Romantic period. And we are going to study that up until the start of the 20th century, so 1820 to about 1900. That period was known as the Romantic period. You might, again, have heard of Romantic literature, Romantic art, Romantic architecture. The Romantic period was very progressive, so it took lots of the musical concepts and ideals from the classical period and sort of pushed them forwards towards the modern day. There were lots more advances in instruments, there were lots more advances in opportunities for musical performance, and the purpose for why composers were composing, what music meant, changed a lot in the Romantic period. Across all three, however, we had concertos. So we had types of work that were written for a soloist and an orchestra accompanying them. In the Baroque period, we also had concertos that had a group of soloists. And that actually died out at the end of the Baroque period. So in the classical period and the Romantic period, we only had one soloist at the front. But prior to that, in a Baroque concerto, you could find you had a few at the front. So when we talk about the Concerto Through Time, we are looking at classical music as a general style, the high art form, sophisticated, notated music in the West, particularly European countries like France, Germany, Austria, Italy, and England, but slightly less so perhaps. And that's where we're looking, that's what we're looking at. And we are studying specifically the three periods of musical history: the Baroque, the Classical, the Romantic periods. And we are looking at one type of composition, which is the concerto. That existed alongside lots of other different types of composition, like symphonies, like string quartets, like pieces just written for a solo instrument on its own, etc. Okay, so that is my overview. So on the sheet, worksheet 1, you will have some general questions checking your understanding of the difference between the classical music and pop music. You will have some questions and stuff to fill in with regards the meaning of a concerto, and also some contrasting types of musical work, types of musical composition. And then finally, you will have information you need to fill in and questions on the three key periods of musical history that we are studying. I hope that has made sense. If it doesn't, please obviously get in touch and email me. But this is meant to be an overview. I'm kind of scanning over lots of stuff, and obviously it's a big time period. What we will do is we will start at the beginning, and we will start with looking at the Baroque. You will start to hear examples of what a concerto actually sounded like, and you will get to know the instruments and the style, and we will go from there and build up your knowledge. So it might be a lot to take in, but don't panic. If you want to do the additional challenge questions that I will put at the bottom of the sheet and do some extra research, question number 1 is, I made this is a question, but I'm giving you some information first. I made reference to the fact that we're talking about musical periods and musical styles. And I compared it to, for example, rock and roll of the 1950s and the 60s, or ballads, or the fact that music now is different to the music in the 80s. And I want you to look at your three periods: Baroque, Classical, and Romantic. And I want you to think about why in the Baroque period it took so long for there to be a change to classical. Why is that period so long, 150 years long? Why were composers not more innovative? Why did more change not happen and become more widespread more quickly? Why is that period of musical history so long before we had a really defined change that was enough of a change that we could say, okay, we're going to call this a new period now because we're not in the Baroque anymore? So that's challenge question number 1. I want you to think about it. You can research it if you want to, but I'd like you to come up with your own ideas. The second challenge question is, I want you to try and find out a bit of information about what classical music looks like today. So talking about music that is being composed and produced in modern times, we obviously know presumably quite a lot about popular music that's being composed nowadays, that's current, but what does classical music look like now in this century? That's a bit of an extra research project for you. However, it is not compulsory. I just want you to make sure that you have understood the key learning points for this video, which is lesson 1. Okay, see you soon. Bye.